In this video, we're finally going to be back to DOM manipulation. And we're going to learn a couple of DOM manipulation techniques, and we will use them together with the for each method that we just learned about. So this is really exciting stuff, so let's get started. And to start, let's actually open up the HTML and CSS files, and we will then keep them open here throughout this project. And I like to have the script always the last. Now in the HTML, we have this navigation bar, so this nav element, which is all of this top part. And then after that, we have the main element. And so that's basically the entire application. And that part is right now invisible. And so that's because here in the CSS, so in line 87, we have the app selector and the opacity is set to 0. And so we need to comment that. And for that, we can, as always, use command / give it a save, and then we can finally see the application here. All right. So logging in and out of this application is essentially just changing this opacity here. And so now the opacity is basically back to 100 because now we commented it out. And so 100 is the default. But anyway, let's go back to our script here. And so what we want to do now is to basically display these movements right here in the application, here in this list. So in this container. So for each movement, we want one element like this. Okay? And we will be able to do that because of the for each method, which will allow us to loop through this array, and then in each iteration, basically create an element like this and display it on the page. So this time, we're finally gonna move away from the console and actually do some DOM manipulation here. All right, so let's move down here after these elements, but still inside of the app part of this file, and then let's write our code. Now we could simply start writing our code out here in the global context. However, that is not a good practice. So whenever we do something like this, it's always best to create a function. So let's call this one print or a display. I prefer display. So display movements. And then we make this function receive the data with which it should actually work. So in this case, that's the movements. So we call this parameter movements because this function should receive one array of movements and then work with that data. So in this case, that's the movements that it should display in the user interface. All right. And so it's a good practice to pass the data into a function instead of, for example, having this function work with a global variable. That would work as well, but it's a lot better to pass that data directly into the function. Okay, so get used to that kind of approach. All right. So again, instead of working with global variables, start passing the data that a function needs actually into that function. So let me, as always, call this function first to see what we will get as an input. And so the movements that I will use here will come from this account1. So essentially, that's going to be this array. So account1.movements. So account1.movements. Okay, and so inside of this function, these movements are simply called movements. And so now let's loop over these movements using what we learned before. So for each, and then our callback function here. Now inside of this function, we need the current movement, and we also need the index. And that's because here actually I have them here number 1, number 2, and so basically we have the movements numbered like this. Okay, so starting with the first movement down and then adding the new ones on top. Okay, all right, so that's the easiest part. now we have to essentially create an HTML that looks like this. So let's go to our HTML file and to actually take a look at what this HTML looks like. So we are inside our app element here, basically. Then we have this movements element, which is all of this container here. And maybe it would be easier to actually see this in the console. So if we did this, maybe we can get rid of this part. Not really. But anyway, now we can see that all of this is the movements. And then in each movement, we have a movements row. So each of this is a movements row. Okay. And so let's now copy the entire code of one movements row, because this is what we want to create in each iteration of the loop with the current data. So essentially, let's take all of this. So I'm going to copy it. And let me now paste it here into a template string. So I will create a variable, which I'm going to call HTML. And then I'm creating a template literal. And template literals are amazing for creating HTML templates like the one we will create now. Because now it's really easy to create a multi-line string like this. Okay, let's just fix indentation here a little bit to make this then easier to understand. Okay, and now all we have to do is to basically replace the data that's not relevant, so this hard-coded data, with our actual movements data. Okay, now this part here of the date we will not do now. We will take care of this in the next section. So let's get rid of it. And then here we have the movements value. So this is formatted, but again, we will just use the plain value that's coming out of the array for now. And so now we can simply insert that here. And so that's mov, right? So mov is the current element in the array that we are looping over. And so in each iteration, that will then be one of the movements in the array. Then here we have toDeposit. And so we will have to check whether a certain movement is a deposit or a withdrawal. So let's delete that. And for now, we can add the number here. So you see 1, 2. And so for that, we now use the I. And so that's why we also needed the current index besides just the current value. Okay. And now we need a way to knowing if it's a deposit or a withdrawal. And so let's use a ternary operator, and let's do that out here as a separate variable, because we will need that twice. We will need it one to write it here on the user interface, but here also this class name depends on that. So you see that we have type deposit, so that's then this green color, and we have type withdrawal, and so that's then this red color. So we will need this information twice. And so let's just calculate it outside here. So I'm going to call it type. And so this is the same logic as before. So if the current movement is greater than 0, then the type should be deposit, or else it should then be withdrawal. Okay. And now let's write that here. So the type here, and again also here in the class name. So we can also basically construct this class name here, which is very useful too. And I hope here you can see that the template literal is really a lifesaver here. Okay, so we created our HTML template here. Now all we need to do is to find a way to actually adding this HTML onto the web page here. So we need to attach this HTML somehow into this container. So into this movements element. Okay. And to do that, we will use a method called insert adjacent HTML. So that's gotta go right here. So let me first write the name of the method, and then I'm going to tell you where we actually have to attach this method to. So it's called insert adjacent HTML. And we are going to call this method on this movements element here. So this container onto which we want to add a new movements row element. So this element here on which we want to add a new movements row, right? So we are looking for an element with the class of movements. And as I told you in the last lecture, I already selected all of these elements. And so in this case, it's this one. And so the name is container movements. Okay. So you see that I used kind of uniform names here. So I have container app for this entire application container and container movements. Then all the other ones are called label, so label welcome, date, and so on and so forth. Then the others are called button, and then all the input fields are all called input, and then whatever the name of them. So to keep it nice and easy to understand. But anyway, this one is called container movements. And so onto there, again, we call insert adjacent HTML. And this method accepts two strings. The first string is the position in which we want to attach the HTML. And this one I'm going to set to after begin, but there are more options. And I think the best way of showing it to you is actually in the documentation. So MDN. And so whenever I need to figure out something, this is how I do it. So I know that down here there is a visualization. And yeah, so these are the four options here. And the one we chose is after begin. So that's this one. So imagine that this P element here is our container movements. And so basically I want to add new elements right after the beginning of this element. And so basically I'm saying here that I want to insert the new child element right after the beginning of the parent element. So again, that's container movements. Then we have before end, which is at the end of the element, as the name says. And then we can even put it outside of the parent element. And then we could even put it outside of the container movements. And sometimes this is useful as well. But usually I always use after begin or before end. And once we see the result, I will explain a bit better why it is after begin and not before end. But anyway, let's go back here because now we need to specify the second argument. And that is the string containing the HTML that we want to insert. And that's it. So if we now run this, it should already work. And yes, it does. So that's amazing. And let's check it out. And let's compare it with our values. And so indeed, the newest one is the last one here. And so that's element number 8. And it is indeed 1300, right? And it is indeed green because it is a deposit. So a positive number. The same with the 70. And then we have minus 130. And so indeed, that's a withdrawal. Beautiful. Now, if we scroll down here, we will see that we still have these two old ones. So basically the two that were already there. And that's because all we are doing is to add new elements to this container. Right? We are only inserting new HTML here inside of the container movements, but we are not overriding anything. And so actually that has to be the first thing that we do. So the first thing is to essentially empty the entire container, and only then we start adding new elements. So that's something common to do, and it is also not difficult at all. So container movements, and now we can use the inner HTML property, inner HTML, and set it to the empty string. And that's it. So this fixes our problem. All right. Now inner HTML here is a little bit similar to text content. So remember that. Now the difference is that text content simply returns the text itself, while HTML returns everything, including the HTML. So all the HTML tags will be included. Okay. But here we are then using inner HTML as a setter. So just like we also used text content equal empty string or equal something else. Remember? So we used to do in our pick game, for example, like whatever and then text content and then set it to 0. Remember that? But as I said, we can also use this to read data. So let's simply log to the console just to understand this property, which is pretty important. So after all this, let's do container movements.inner HTML. So we're simply reading the inner HTML and then logging it to the console. So console, and indeed, here you see all of this HTML. All right. So essentially, that's the HTML that we just created. Okay. But let's get rid of this. I just wanted to show you both sides or both applications of inner HTML. All right. And finally, I wanted to show you why I used after begin and not before end. Well, let me show you what would happen with before end. I think this is how it works. So before end. Yeah. So with that, the order of the movements would be inverted. Okay. And that's because each new element would simply be added after the previous one. So at the end of the container, right? And so that's after all the child elements that are already in there. And that's why I wanted it to be the other way around. Because like this, it will always be basically appended to all the other children. So any new child element will appear before all the other child elements that were already there. And so now we are back to the order that we wanted here. All right, that's amazing. So we completed the first part of our user interface here already, and all with the power of the for each method. And then also we introduced some new concepts. In particular here, the insert adjacent HTML method, and then the inner HTML property. Now, there are many other ways of creating elements in JavaScript besides this one here, and we're going to study all of them in great detail in a future section. But this here is actually the one that I like the most. It's the easy, quick and dirty solution, so to say. So all we have to do is to create a string of HTML, and then we can insert that simply with this method. So very simple, very straightforward. So this is some great DOM manipulation that we did right here, and I'm really happy about the result that we got here in our application. Great, so let's now move on.